Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Daily Report. I'm your host, Vago Muradia. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. And joining us now is United States Army Lieutenant General Neil Thurgood, the Director of the Army's Hypersonic Directed Energy, Space, and Rapid Acquisition. Sir, thanks so much for making time for us.
Well, first of all, thank you for having us this morning. Taking the time to reach out and let the Army talk a little bit about what we're doing as we move forward across the modernization programs of the Army.
It's an absolute pleasure. And sir, before we get started, a quick shout out to all of our sponsors. Our global coverage is sponsored by Leonardo DRS. Northrop Grumman sponsors our weekly cyber report and broader cyber coverage. Fincantieri Marinette Marine sponsors our naval coverage. And of course, Bell sponsors this podcast. Sir, you're charged with overseeing one of the most complex portfolio programs in the Army, including delivering its highest priority element, which is a hypersonic missile battery that General Jim McConville, the Army Chief of Staff, wants operational by 2023. You're also working on directed energy programs, and of course, you're also trying to deliver rapid acquisition to the force on an ongoing basis. How is the coronavirus pandemic impacting your folks and your ability to deliver on what is a very ambitious schedule dictated by national security requirements?
Well, that's a great question. First, let me start by just thanking our national leaders across our government, across the states, and our first responders, those in the medical community, who are really on the front lines of this fight every day for what they're doing for our nation. You know, one great thing about, amongst all the things that are great about America is in a time of crisis, this nation comes together not only to support our nation, but also support the global community. So I couldn't be more proud of them, us as a nation, and those that are on the front lines of this fight as we go through this, and our hearts and our thoughts and prayers go out to them. In terms of executing the modernization of the Army, in times of crisis like this, we've been really blessed with strong leadership inside the Department of Defense, and particularly inside the Army with Secretary McCarthy, and as you mentioned, with General McConville. The thing that gives us that strength is the focus of the mission, which, as you indicated, for hypersonics is very clear in FY23 and others for directed energy and other mission sets. The way we get through this crisis is together, and we have a very strong team that's executing that mission today in the government. And when I say the government, I mean our military, our government civilians, our contracted workforce that helps us do this, that are subject matter experts, and they are just doing a phenomenal job of working in a very decentralized manner today in their alternate work locations to make sure that we stay on track. In addition to that, our defense industrial base across all of our programs are just doing a phenomenal job of being creative and being innovative in how they're keeping themselves on track. And I'll give you a couple examples. So number one, we're learning how to do software and write software in a decentralized manner rather than in a group in a room. We're in our touch labor in our factories. We no longer have big single shifts of a lot of people. The industry has done a phenomenal job of creating small shifts with small groups, so we can stay in line with the social distancing rules, so we can stay in line with those things we need to do to protect the workforce. At the end of the day, it is people that do the work and make this happen. And so our hats off to the department leadership and to our industry partners who are really working this hard across all the domains and across the Army as we move forward. So we're really proud of them.
Given that the Army measures everything, sir, is there any sense on either the cost impact or the schedule impact of this virus, and how much more may have to be spent to catch up? Because at the end of the day, there is a learning curve associated, and there are tests and group things that are actually not happening now that are somewhat key. Talk to us about, your sense on all those vectors.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of areas there that you're pointing to that we're critically watching, right? So any of the major events and milestones that we're tracking to, we have not seen any shifts or not anticipating any shifts in those key critical dates. In program management, you would call that the critical path of all the tasks that have to get done to support the outcome that we desire. And again, that's really great work on behalf of the partnership between the defense industrial base and the government. I think what you see, or what we can anticipate happening, is that down in the supply chains, and I just had a great meeting Tuesday with all our industrial partners at my level to talk about not necessarily the big primes, but the supply chain down into the multiple tiers of the supply chain. And I think what we're watching and measuring is very carefully is in those smaller companies, not necessarily the big companies who have the ability to shift across programs much stronger than a very small company who may be, for example, providing a singular component, and half of their business is commercial and half of their business is with the government. And because the Honorable Lord at the Office of the Secretary of Defense level and the President has put out the Industrial Base Act, we're watching those because they may not have the capital at that lower level to cover the no longer commercial work they're doing and to move that all into the government work they're doing. And so we're watching very closely at the supply chain level as we go forward. The second piece we're watching very closely is, and I'll just speak this in terms of hypersonics. The hypersonics industrial base is for producing weapon systems is very immature. In fact, most of that technology is owned by the government today. And so we're in the process of transitioning that technology from the government labs who are operating under the government rule sets, and the industrial base who is also operating under the government rule sets, and a leader follower. So we're watching very closely that relationship. And I'll contrast that with the directed energy relationship industrial base, which is still maturing, but much more mature than the hypersonics industrial base. So there is a competitive environment already. Companies producing laser weapon systems. And so they have the ability. I'm not trying to transition technology to them. I'm trying to pull technology from them. Where in hypersonics, we're trying to push technology to the industrial base. And so we're watching that transition very closely.
It is an extraordinary time. United States, obviously a very long leader in hypersonics. We took a bit of a pause. Our adversaries have certainly been fielding a lot of capability. You have a very ambitious deadline to field a battery of 4 hypersonic weapons by 2023. The Army and the Navy conducted a very successful joint test on March 19. As the nation was locking down, you guys were out there at Kwajalein doing a very, very important test. Talk to us a little bit, though, right? Hypersonics are very mystifying for a lot of people, and there's also a lot of misunderstanding about them. There are some folks who look at the prospect of adversaries having this and saying, oh my God, we won't be able to do anything. We won't be able to move. We can get hit anywhere with these exceptionally devastating weapons that also have not just point strike, but area denial capabilities, which makes them more problematic. Talk to us about the fact, the fiction, the myth, the reality about hypersonics and how everybody needs to think about them so that we get out of a little bit of a deer in the headlights kind of sense that some people have with these, to understanding how they are both strategic weapons, but also tactical weapons. How do we need to think about this space?
Okay. Let me, there's a bunch of questions in there. Let me see if I can separate them out a little bit to add some clarity to the questions you're asking. So you're right. Our nation understands, has developed the materials we need to produce hypersonic weapons for quite some time. We have a lot of that was developed in the space industry. as we have expanded our space portfolio in our nation. And that work has continued in our science and technology communities for quite some time. To your point, though, which I think is exactly correct, while we've been off in the last 18 years or so fighting the global war on terror as a focus of our national defense strategy, our adversaries, Russia and China, have not been in that fight at the same scale, and they've been modernizing their forces. And so they've taken the technologies that are produced, a lot of it in our great universities and academic institutions, and they've operationalized that or are working to operationalize that. So I think we all recognize that on the 27th of December, the Russians announced they have this operational capability in some limited number. We suspect that China will be there quickly. And so as we came out of the global war on terror, our national defense strategy changed to the great power competition that we all know and read about. And that caused the services, and I'll just speak for the Army, our great leadership, Secretary McCarthy, General McConville, the Vice, the Under, and to put in a modernization strategy that would quickly bring us and update our equipment so that we could be competitive in the great power competition. And so, as you know, the Army stood up the Army Features Command under a great leader, General Murray, and General Murray works really close with Honorable Jetty, the Army Acquisition Executive, to establish the modernization priority. So if you hear General Murray speak, he would talk about the modernization 31+3 programs that are key in the modernization strategy. And as you indicated, hypersonics is key. Directed energy is key in those modernization strategies. When you talk about the hypersonics in general, we sometimes misconstrue that word to have lots of meanings to what you're describing earlier. The term hypersonic simply means that the object goes greater than Mach 5. That's the technical definition of that term in the broad sense. When we refer to it in the terms of a hypersonic weapon, it is speed and maneuverability combined that gives you the capability, the operational capability you're looking for. And by the way, all of our ballistic missiles go greater than Mach 5. Not all of them, but a large portion of them. So sometimes it becomes a colloquial word, and I'll give you an example. Sometimes you might ask for a Kleenex when really you want a tissue, right? Kleenex is just a brand name for the tissue. And so hypersonics sometimes gets used in that way. So when we refer to hypersonics in our program, it is a combination of speed and maneuverability and range that gives you the capability, the operational capability that we're looking for. Inside of the government, there are multiple hypersonic programs working in all the services. And in the long-range hypersonic weapon system for the Army, we are teamed with the Navy in our two programs. We have a joint effort together, and we include the Missile Defense Agency in that, who has the defensive piece. And of course, OSD, our Office of Secretary of Defense, is a part of that. So Vice Admiral Johnny Wolf, my battle buddy, my partner in the Navy, and I are teamed at the hip, and our teams below us are working very well together to produce this outcome. We share the common hypersonic glide body, which is the killing mechanism, I guess, for lack of a better term, and we share a common missile stack. And so we obviously launch different, we have a land-based mobile system, and they have a sea-based system. So there are some differences, but at the base, we're linked together. And as you indicated, the flight test that we had on the 19th of March was one of a series. There'll be 5 more of those flight tests between now and FY23 when we field at various times. and each of those flight tests have a very defined objective of a thing we need to look at, to test, to ensure that when we give this weapon system to a soldier or a sailor, that it is safe for them to use, and it will accomplish the mission, accomplish the task we need it to accomplish. And so we will continue down that path on those flight tests as we go ahead. The last piece you mentioned that I'll just touch on is weapon systems will continue to be modernized over time. Hypersonics is the next in that modernization strategy that you see and talk about in the great power competition. This is a strategic weapon. This weapon is designed to reach deep into the threat or the adversary's domain so that we can penetrate what we call the A2AD environment, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Right.
In order to create, to penetrate, in order to create lanes of opportunity for follow-on forces. As you see our potential adversaries extending their sphere of influence, we have to have a mechanism to create lanes to get into that sphere of influence. Should we as a nation desire that outcome? And so it's critical for that opportunity to be given to the National Command Authority, which is why it's one of the modernization priorities. And I hope that's helpful.
It is. How do you assess, before we get a little bit into the programmatics, I mean, how do you assess the capabilities that our adversaries have in this field? There was some question about whether the Russian, how truthful anybody is being in sort of fielding these capabilities, but as the man who's, in charge or playing a prominent role in how the United States is preparing, how do you assess what China and Russia are doing in terms of capability, and how do they shape your decision-making on it?
Well, there's no doubt that our potential adversaries in the great power competition are claiming a great capability, and that capability, until we know otherwise, we have to treat as a credible response. Our credible capability, we need to have a credible response to that as we go forward. So, staying in the domain of unclassified, I think we need to be prepared as a nation, and I think our leadership is helping us do that. They have a credible capability. It's new, it's emerging for all of our nations, and I think we need to treat that with the right amount of respect as we move forward. We watch our adversaries just as our adversaries watch us, our potential adversaries. It's a continuous learning curve that we watch and adjust and modernize, and we watch and adjust and modernize, just as we have throughout history. And we're just in that next phase of modernizing our forces in line with the National Defense Strategy, so that we, the services, are prepared to provide the National Command Authority the options they may need should they choose to have a desired outcome.
Are we working, talk to us a little bit about the ConOps side of things as well, right? Because having this capability is important, but then having the right concepts of operations in place to maximize the effectiveness of what we're developing is something that's equally important. Where are you in the process of informing that sort of doctrinal, intellectual, operational side of the equation as you develop the hardware side of it?
Yeah, absolutely. In the Army, when we field out a new weapon system, it's not just the material solution that we just show up to a unit and say, here's your new piece of kit, right? And go do great things. We actually have a very defined process that you probably heard the term DOT-MIL PLF, which is an acronym for Doctrine, Organization, Training, Material, Leadership, Education, Personnel, and Facilities, and Policies. Those domains all get done in parallel as we begin to mature the weapon system. And so our partner, Major General Ken Camper at the Fire Center of Excellence in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, he leads the team who is writing that doctrine. Of course, the doctrine of how we employ this is informed by the capabilities that we're building on the material side and that we're testing to validate that the material does or has the expected outcome. And so there is a group of us that are synchronized. There are 8 of us that do this across these different domains I just mentioned, and we call that the octagon. I'm not overly original. There's 8 of us, so I called it the octagon. We synchronize every 2 weeks, and we synchronize to the outcome that's needed for our nation. In our case, we've been given the task to produce our first battery by FY23, fourth quarter FY23. And so the doctrine people are writing the doctrine. The training people are establishing the training plans and how we're going to train. The logistics teams are figuring out right now how we're going to sustain this and what we need to use. The leadership piece is being developed. What facilities need to be adjusted. What are the policies that are going to be used to guide the application of this weapon system? And so sometimes we get focused on the material piece, but as a leader, what I want to make sure is that we provide a capability which includes the right doctrine, the right training, the right leaders, the right facilities, the right policies, the right personnel. All of that creates a weapon system. It's just not a piece of material that we put on the ground.
What more do you need to go faster, right? Because there are some folks who are looking at this. I mean, you're a year, roughly March 2019, as I recall, is when the chief looked at you and said, I want it by 2025. And then that got amended to 2023. And there are those who look at it and say, wow, that's a top priority, but it's still not moving fast enough. What are the things that you need to be able to move fast enough? The department added dramatically to the budget, which was, I'm sure, very welcome for you and everybody in the enterprise. What do you need to go faster?
We get asked that question a lot, and I think there's a pretty clear mechanism for that. And when we just over a year ago, we were given this task. Our team when we started forming our team to put this together. We went very quickly to the plan, or give the plan to field the battery in FY23. As you develop weapon systems, if you have a very mature industrial base, and I'll use directed energy, then you can buy more things with more money, right? If there's a production process in place, then you can add money and increase production relatively quickly. Where you're still transitioning technologies from government labs to a commercial industrial base, where you're still in the early stages of testing. Although we just had a great successful flight test, we still have a bunch of that work in front of us to be successful. And so when I get asked this question by Congress, and when Secretary McCarthy asked me this question, what I try to remind our leadership with is that it's hard to accelerate design and completing inventions. That's not the place to execute a rapid acceleration. And so if you look at the budget that we've sought for, we are very deliberate in building the budget for 19 and 20, and you'll see, as you know, in the president's budget, a ramp up in 21. Until we finish all of the design work, and until we finish all of the engineering work. So I'll give you an example. We have to design and build the transporter erector launcher, which goes on the back of an M870 trailer. So we have the M870 trailer in the Army inventory. It does not have a vertical launch on mechanism, which is a piece that lifts the missile up into its launch position. So we have to design that, and that work's happening right now. It's hard to accelerate design. You can't necessarily put 10 people on one drawing and do it faster, right? It is easier to accelerate when you get a production process in place. I can accelerate the delivery of the weapon system or more of it with the design. So in the early stages where we are now, for example, our theme in FY20 is finish the invention, complete the design. That's our theme. So that when we get to 21, with the dollars we've asked for, we can accelerate the production of those pieces of equipment into the battery in 23. And then once we have that, then if our nation decides to, they can accelerate the production of other outcomes or more of the same outcome, but that's what our nation decides to do. So we're very careful to not rush through the design and invention, and very careful to make sure that we know where the acceleration points are when we have that work complete.
Clearly, you're laying the foundation for much larger serial production. And of course, investigating what are the different sorts of systems that would fall into that portfolio, even though you're working on delivering that first initial battery, which adds an even other dimension of complexity to the task. At the end of the day, any deterrent system depends on an adversary looking at it and saying, wow, well, they've got 4 weapons. That doesn't worry me as much. It worries them a lot more. It's like, wow, they've got hundreds of these weapons at their disposal. Is there any sense about the size of arsenal that's required to have that sort of deterrent capability at range and operational utility, given that from an anti-access area denial standpoint, each one of these adversary nations has built multiple layered defensive and offensive screens, whether close, intermediate, or long range? How are you thinking about what the volume of this arsenal or this magazine needs to be to deliver that deterrent capability that we seek?
Yeah, there are a couple of layers to that question, as you talked about, right? So I think the first piece is, as our team at Fort Steele starts to write the doctrine, that informs that very question that you're speaking of. In our requirement of a service to support the combatant commands, what is their demand signal and what is the doctrine we need in terms of the numbers to support that demand signal as we go forward. And I think all would agree with you that, to have a few number of a thing versus many numbers of a thing creates a different potential sight picture for our adversaries. And so there's a team that's working on how many of these things do we actually want in the end game across not only the Army, but across the department, right? So as you realize that in our combatant commands operational plans, it requires the joint service team, right? The Army doesn't have to be able to shoot everything, and neither does the Navy, neither does the Air Force. It's a combination of tools that we need, and one of those tools is hypersonics, and a subset of the hypersonics tools are inside the Army. And so that work is being done right now. The second part of that question I thought you asked was really intuitive, which is to say that you don't need the same weapon system to kill everything, right? You can have different range of weapon systems to kill at different distances at different times in the fight. So what I need to initially to get into the anti-access aerial denial area might be different than what I need once I'm there inside that fighting at a different range. And so there is a layered effect to all of our weapon systems, and hypersonics is part of that layered effect. Obviously, hypersonics has a very long range and can strike at great distances at great speeds to create that layered strategic effect. And we have other tools in the toolbox of our weapons platforms to use at different times and at different layered effects, depending on the distance that we want. And a lot of those are tied into the modernization strategy that General Murray leads us through the 31+3 programs.
Let me ask you, sir, about the defensive element of this. One of the most interesting attributes of the tests that you've been conducting is that the Missile Defense Agency is intimately involved in these tests in order to be able to find ways to adapt current systems to improve defenses. Talk to us about the defenses against hypersonic weapons and how the Army's directed energy investments might end up proving very valuable in this, because you're also overseeing, it's always great seeing Dr. Yaw down and the tremendous work that his team is doing down in Huntsville, where you're based as well. talk to us about the defensive side of things and the opportunity for directed energy to play a very, very important role in that.
Right. So let me start with that relationship is actually governed by a memorandum of agreement that the services, the Army, Navy, Air Force, OSD, and the Missile Defense Agencies have all signed. And we do that intentionally so that in our organizations, we understand the relationships and roles in this. And of course, Vice Admiral John Hill, the director for the Missile Defense Agency, and I are, along with Johnny Wolf, we all served together in MDA when we were younger officers. Of course, now we're all working at the next level. So number one, it's great to have a partnership that we know and have built relationships over time, through shared combat experiences. And I have great respect for both of those great Navy officers. Everything that we do, every test that we do, whether it's a ground test, a system test, whether it's a component test of a piece of technology that we're trying to complete the design on, we are 100% sharing that across the services in the Missile Defense Agency. John Hill has been given the great responsibility to work the defensive piece of hypersonics. He has a great team over there that helps him do that technology. What we can't afford to do is to do build a bunch of systems to go work on the defense and not combine that with the work on the offense, right? If I'm going to work on the test on the 19th of March that we just did, we want Vice Admiral Hill and his team in there watching what we're doing. We want him to understand our technology so he can start developing the defensive mechanisms for that. So it's 100% linkage between the offense and the defense as we go forward to preserve the great resources of our nation. And it also accelerates the learning on both sides. So as John Hill and his great team learn about the defense, then we learn what we need to be prepared to put into the offensive piece to counter that. So it's a much smaller give and take at the program level is the same thing as the threat at the national level, right? What our adversaries do, we try to counter. What we do, they try to counter, and then we do that learning very quickly inside the relationship between Vice Admiral Hill, Vice Admiral Wolf, and myself and the Air Force. Yeah, so the relationship between the offensive piece, which is Vice Admiral Wolf and myself and the Air Force, and Vice Admiral John Hill on the defensive piece is really, really great because we're learning together simultaneously and preserving those resources so we can really focus the outcome of our resources on the most important aspect of both the offense and defensive piece. And I'll just pause right there.
Let me ask you about speed. One of the other things in your title is obviously rapid acquisition in order to be able to push capability out to the force. You were an operational soldier for a long time, distinguished helicopter aviator with the 160th, certainly one of the most elite outfits in the United States military. So you understand from sort of the user piece of this, the dire need to try to get capability out there, and you were focused on doing that after you transitioned to become an acquisition officer both in Iraq and in Afghanistan. What are the keys to driving fast but driving right?
So I think there are three keys, and I think we have those three keys. So the first is, as you mentioned, look, everything we do is about the soldier, and I can tell you when sitting with the Secretary McCarthy and General McConville, the Vice, and the Under, General Murray, Dr. Honorable Jetty, we are building these weapon systems to give our soldiers the opportunity to be successful on the battlefield. And I think about those soldiers every day. I started as a young private a long time ago, and so I watch and I think about every bolt we're putting into this thing, every software we're writing. How is this going to be easy for Private Thurgood somewhere? Because they're going to be cold, wet, and hungry, and they're going to be in a place they don't want to be, and we have asked to put them there. And so we need to make it as easy for them to be successful as we can. So I would put all that under the title of focus. And when the Secretary said, to me and our team, you need to have this prepared in fourth quarter of 23. There was no lack of clarity and focus for me. And so focus and clarity is always critical to successful outcomes. The next thing that's important to successful outcomes is the team that's building this. And so we have the focus, and I'll put resources in the focus because we've been given the resources we asked for. And then we're given the ability to put the right team in place. So I was given the ability to hand select my top tier leadership in my organization. And, Miss Claire's on the phone, and she was one of those. She's really, really good at what she does, probably one of the best. And so that team helps us keep our focus and keep our attention on the desired outcome across all of our areas of responsibility. So focus, and then building the team, and the Octagon's part of that team, and the Navy and the Missile Defense Agency are part of that team. And then the third piece is really the authority and the responsibility to execute. So in our case, in terms of the RCCTO, our leadership of our Army is allowed our organization to have both contracting authorities and milestone decision authorities. It's certainly not new. It's a little bit unusual. It's been done before, and having those authorities, to a certain dollar value, I don't have carte blanche, and nor would I want that. We can actually make decisions that need to be made at my level and below very quickly. And because I'm a direct report to the Secretary of the Army, my chain of command up is very quick. And so when you have the alignment of the accountabilities and the authorities above you and below you, then you can move that decision cycle very quickly. So I would say those three things are very important. Clear focus from the leadership of the nation, down through the Secretary of the Army. We have a great team that's in place, and then we have the accountability and authorities aligned to that outcome. And so, that group of people I described to you, the Secretary, the Under, Honorable Jetty, those three, the Chief, the Vice, and General Murray, Army Futures Command, those six leaders, those six great men, that they are what we call our board of directors. And so when I go seek a decision, I seek it from those six. It's obviously chaired by the Secretary of the Army. That's it. And when you go speak to those leaders, it's a very clear conversation. I need, Thurgood, you to do this, or I go back to them and say, leadership, I need this outcome, and I need your help to get it. And they have just been phenomenally supportive and grateful with their time when we've required a decision of them. And they know how to make decisions because they have great insight to the modernization programs of the Army and where we need the Army to be. So those three things, I think, are key.
Sir, thanks so very much. Really appreciate you taking as much time as you did. A whole bunch of questions we didn't get to, but can't wait to talk to you again. One of the things that'll have to wait for next time is spaces in your title, and but we didn't get a chance to talk about how that's going to work out eventually with Space Force and a couple of other things. But you're welcome on any time, and we would love to keep the conversation going. Thanks so much. Best of luck. Stay healthy, and hope the same for yours and your team.
Well, listen, again, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. You have a grand history of helping and watching our nation in the Defense Department from your early days till now. We appreciate that. Listen, we have a great team, and I can't be more proud of them for what they're doing. The Army team, the Joint team, everything that's happening. At the end of the day, I tell my team all the time, we exist to help our soldiers and sailors be successful on the battlefield. That's why we do what we do, and we're passionate about it. I think about those soldiers every day, those that are deployed, and similar to, as you said, our soldiers here that are working on our hospitals, that are not actually in military uniform, but they're soldiers just the same to me, working so hard on this pandemic, watching after our nation and our communities. So we appreciate the opportunity and keep them in our thoughts and prayers every day. So thank you.
Thanks again, sir. And thanks for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DEFAERO Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report, and check us out on LinkedIn. And check out our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman, and our technology report sponsored by General Motors Defense. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight. Bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.